Hey, everybody, and welcome to the Springs Advocacy 101, our fourth edition. This month, we are going to be focusing on state programs to conserve land, which is one of the most important things that we can do to protect our water resources as well as wildlife and pretty much anything else we care about in the environmental community. I want to thank you all for being here. We're going to be streaming live on Facebook and YouTube. If you have any questions, you can just put them right into the chats on Facebook or YouTube. They will pop up here and we will get to them at the end of the webinar. If you're not already, we'd love for you to join up and become a Springs advocate. We are right on the cusp of the 2026 legislative session. FSC and our partners have invested a lot in technology to be able to make it easy and effective for you to contact your legislator, including our new mobile text alert system that we rolled out last session. So you can text FSC to 844-722-3080 to sign up for mobile action alerts, or go to our website and sign up to become a free Springs Advocate member where you can help us along with Ryan and Gene, who are here with me today, to advocate for more funding for land conservation. And I'm very happy to be joined by Gene Kelly. Gene is the president of the Florida Native Plant Society. Before that, for 16 years, he worked as a conservation land planner at the Southwest Florida Water Management District, and then for the Nature Conservancy. Thanks a lot for being here, Gene, being our expert on all of these programs.
My pleasure indeed.
And we also have Ryan Worthington. Ryan, my good bud, a phenomenal advocate for Florida's conservation lands. You all know him as the Florida Excursionist on social media. He's also one of the founders of Floridians Advocating for Florida's Outdoors, or FAFO. Ryan's going to talk about some of his advocacy work. And also, Ryan spends a lot of time actually hiking these lands, as much as anybody I know, and actually getting out and enjoying our forests and state parks. So thanks a lot for being here, Ryan. Good to see you.
It's a pleasure. Love talking land conservation.
Awesome. So we're going to start out today. We're going to really go through kind of the three premier land conservation programs at the state level in Florida. When we think about land conservation in Florida, at least for me, I start thinking about Florida Forever. Gene, could you tell us a little bit about the purpose of the Florida Forever program, and a little bit about maybe the process that lands go to get on that list and to be acquired?
Sure. And just to provide a little bit of context, I think it's important to look before Florida Forever. In 1990, the state created the Preservation 2000 program, and that ran to the year 2000, 10 years. It provided $300 million a year in funding for land conservation. So Florida Forever is the successor to that. It started as soon as Preservation 2000 ended, and more important context, for the first 7-8 years of Florida Forever, it likewise received $300 million per year for land conservation purchases. The kinds of lands that you would purchase through the Florida Forever program, if you think about state parks and state forests, and the wildlife management areas that are made available to the public for hunting and other kinds of recreation, typically managed by the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission. Those are bought with Florida Forever funds. Likewise, the water management districts have very active land conservation programs, or they have historically. Less active lately because of the lack of funding. But those water management districts, they each received a prescribed share of the Florida Forever funding. There was and still is a formula that dictates how that funding is divvied out among the different agencies. As for the process,
let me ask you about that, Gene, though. With that formula, when was the last time the legislature actually stuck with the formula? Do you know? Because I don't think in my time working on this, maybe 10 years ago, but it's been a long time since they followed that formula. But I think FDAC's got like a much smaller percentage than what they've been getting lately.
Yes, and in fact, I would say that around the time the recession hit, 2008, and that's when the funding just stopped. And since that point, I think there were a couple times where they kind of followed that formula, but otherwise it has been largely ignored, which is a shame because it also meant that certain of the programs that were funded by it, like Florida Communities Trust, they got the short end of the stick.
Which we'll look at later. So
Yeah.
you were going to tell us about some of the conservation lands and what kind of properties are acquired by Florida Forever.
Right. Well, they want to preserve basically the best of what's left. And they do that by using a very science-based process. And there is this Florida Forever Conservation Needs Assessment that is based on the Florida statutes. It's intended to ensure that the state is spending the taxpayers' money on the right land. It vets the natural resource values. It provides transparency, opportunities for the public to be involved and comment on the proposed purchases. And what I have here in this bullet list, this is most, but not all, of the measuring sticks, if you will, that are used to identify lands that really merit being protected through Florida Forever. So the first of those, rare species habitat conservation priorities, that actually maps known habitat for 634 different species. Most but not all are officially listed, but they're all considered more or less imperiled or at some risk. I'm happy to say that more than half of those species are plants, which often get the short end of the stick. In contrast, strategic habitat conservation areas, 62 focal species identified by the Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission. Those are all vertebrate animal species. Now, everybody's probably heard about the Florida Wildlife Corridor. One of the other measuring sticks that's used to identify the lands that are really important are those that will help maintain connectivity among our conservation lands, fill gaps, and help ensure that at the end of the day, we'll have a network of lands that can really function in the long term, allow species migrations, gene exchange, so that plants and animal populations remain healthy. Underrepresented natural communities. There are actually about 12 different natural community types, habitat types that are considered imperiled. So if a particular land area is rich in those, it gains more points. Protecting floodplains, fragile coastal resources, wetlands, high aquifer recharge. There are actually a couple others, but when you put all this together, basically the state comes up with a kind of scorecard, and that allows them, when they go through the process of approving Florida Forever projects, to really identify the projects that should be really ranked high for meeting the largest number of these yardsticks, these measures of conservation value. And that process, I did mention, it's transparent and provides opportunities for the public to be involved. Anybody can propose a land area to be part of the Florida Forever project list. And if someone does nominate a piece of land, a land area, it gets reviewed by the Division of State Lands, the Florida Natural Areas Inventory, which is an arm of Florida State University. Their biologists, ecologists also evaluate those nominations, and they provide feedback to the Acquisition and Restoration Council. So that is a committee that is comprised of natural resource professionals, the primary agencies, the Department of Environmental Protection, the Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, Florida Forest Service. Each of those agencies has a high-ranking staff person that serves on the Acquisition and Restoration Council. Then each of those agencies and the governor are allowed to appoint other representatives. So you have a group of people that really do understand natural resources. And when a project is proposed, it gets voted on twice, not once, but first the Acquisition and Restoration Council takes a look at it to see if it really merits being investigated further. If they decide that it does, then that starts a more intensive review, actual on-site visits by biologists and ecologists from the state agencies and from the Florida Natural Areas Inventory. And then they basically report back to the Acquisition and Restoration Council. And then they decide whether to actually add that nominated project to the list. And then eventually also all those projects get ranked. And right now there are 132 Florida Forever projects that have gone through that process. Many of them have been on there a number of years. It can take a while to put together some of these projects. And if you really want to investigate it, this is, again, transparent. You can go to DEP's website and look up the Florida Forever program, and you can actually download the 2025 Florida Forever Conservation Plan. It's over 900 pages. It includes a report on each and every one of those projects to explain why they merit being on that list.
Excellent. And I think there's 2 points to highlight. One is that this is a willing seller program. So all the lands that are on the list, these are the owners of the properties have agreed to put their properties on the list for possible sale, right?
Correct. If a landowner does, if they have no interest, they can ask for their land, their property to be removed from the list, and it will be. And another thing that I should have mentioned is Florida Forever funds can be used to purchase either a fee title interest in the property, meaning buying it outright, or it can be used to purchase a conservation easement. A conservation easement means that the property still remains in private ownership, but the easement places certain restrictions on the use of that property in perpetuity. And typically that means that areas that are in natural habitat have to remain that way. Activities, maybe ranching activities or forestry activities that they have engaged in, they might be able to continue doing those within certain limits. So the idea is to kind of identify a piece of land that has high natural value, lots of conservation value, that could still continue to be used by the private landowner in the same manner and have those values be maintained. So
right.
You have those two different approaches to conservation. The important
historically,
thing, if it's privately owned, if it's a conservation easement, more than likely there will be no public access. It's very rare where the public would be allowed to enter those properties, but they are protected in perpetuity.
And historically, most Florida Forever acquisitions have been fee simple. I think they've been going more towards conservation easements in the last couple of years, but I think most of the lands we've seen have been fee simple with public access. Is that right?
That has been the transition that we've seen over the last 10 years or so. More and more focus on conservation easements.
Right. And we're going to talk about conservation easements under rural and family lands in a moment, but there's really some differences between those two. I think we're going to dive into that more, but just to stress that the Florida Forever conservation easements are still going through that same type of ARC process. I mean, they are going through the ARC process, being ranked on their conservation value, even though it is still an easement, not a fee simple purchase. Is that right?
Correct. Yes.
Great. So moving from there, one of the questions we had was already pop up is, the state has plenty of money. They're just choosing not to fund Florida Forever. And I think that is definitely true. Our state's budget was over $100 billion last year. Gene did a great job of kind of walking us up to the program, through the Great Recession. After the Great Recession is when Amendment 1 went on the ballot in 2014 with the intention of dedicating 1/3 of documentary stamp taxes. Those are the taxes folks pay on real estate property transactions, and to use that money, we thought primarily for land conservation. And I think most folks thought that we'd be at least at $300 million a year that was historically allocated, if not much, much more. But as you can see from the slide, that has not been the case. The most funding that Florida Forever has received in that time is $100 million. And more years than not, it is significantly below that. Now, in 2016, the legislature enacted 375.041, which laid out how the Land Acquisition Trust Fund monies would be spent. And right now, $100 million should be dedicated every year, according to statute, to Florida Forever. I think all three of us on this webinar would argue that that is far, far too little. But we're not even coming close some years to accomplishing that. So last year, the Florida Forever appropriation came in at a paltry $18 million. And it was actually going to be $3 million, but Senator Albritton, Senate President Albritton, sprinkled $15 million in on the last day just to get it up to $18 million. So I think this is not nearly enough to be able to conserve the lands that we need to conserve, to be able to provide some balance to all the development in Florida. And Ryan Worthington, I know every year the state puts out a Florida Forever assessment where they look at what acres have been acquired and what's left. Do you want to walk through that for us?
Yeah. So basically, when you have all the lands that are on the Florida Forever list to be acquired, they have them ranked, and they know pretty much what an appraised value is. And they have and how many acres they are and where they're at and what the ecological benefit is. But right now, we have close to 3 million acres to be acquired. Now, those are spread out through Florida. Some of them that are closer to metropolitan areas, they are going to be much more expensive to acquire. And so you're going to get less acres for more money. But some of them, like around the Apalachicola River, they're much more cost effective to purchase, so you can get a bigger bang for your buck. But right now, the estimated cost to acquire all these lands is north of $20 billion. And with the funding that we've seen lately, now I know, Gene, you talked about back when a dollar went a lot further in the 90s and the 2000s when they're dropping $300 million a year. What we've been seeing lately is really sad, especially by comparison. But the average the last 10 years is about $61 million. And if we're looking at that rate, if things don't change, then I think all of our lifetimes plus grandchildren, great grandchildren will eclipse before we could possibly see this come to fruition. But it's something that really highlights why we really need to have more funding for fee simple conservation land purchases, and also the conservation easements.
Yeah. Something that concerns me, Ryan, is that 336-year time frame. I don't think we can get all those bulldozers to stop all that development. So we're actually involved in a race, and there's no way we can hope to win that race if it's going to take 336 years.
And I think we're losing that race pretty bad right now. And I thought one thing might be good to do is just to give folks an idea of some of the properties, what kind of projects are actually on the list. I'm a bit of a Springs homer, obviously. So my favorite project on the list is the Florida's First Magnitude Springs project, which is the #1 ranked project under the Partnership and Regional Incentives program, with about a little under 7,000 acres left to acquire. And really, that has not moved at all. With all the lip service we hear about protecting water in Springs, we have not been seeing those critical properties be acquired because there's just not enough money. I would note, and we'll talk a little bit about the Destin acquisition later, but we could have bought all of those Florida first magnitude Springs properties for less than what the state paid for that spit of land in Destin. Ryan Worthington, do you have a favorite Florida Forever project you want to highlight?
Sure. It's hard to choose, right? I mentioned Apalachicola River, which is, protecting, the watershed there. But think about some of the most critical and important things that we have in Florida. Lake Wales Ridge. I know that may not, be like as impressive as like the Springs or the Everglades, but that is some of the oldest exposed area of Florida, some of the highest ground, because, millions of years ago, Florida looked more like the Bahamas. And what was exposed was the Lake Wales Ridge. And that is a highly prized area, especially for development. That is one of them. And then you have Panther Glades to the south, which looks to connect a lot of conservation properties and secure habitat for the Florida panthers. So those are a few of my favorites.
Yeah.
Team?
Yeah. Well, I got to say, Lake Wales Ridge, Ryan, there are dozens of critically imperiled endemic plant species that occur on the Lake Wales Ridge and nowhere else on the planet. For that alone, I really like the Lake Wales Ridge project. But I have kind of selfish tendencies. I think we all do to some extent. So right here close to home, the Anatoliga Hammock project, it's nearly complete. And that would, if we complete it, it would close the little bit of a gap that remains between all the coastal lands through the Nature Coast, the Chassahowitzka Wildlife Management Area, and the Chassahowitzka National Wildlife Refuge with the Withlacoochee State Forest inland. I think bridging that gap would be hugely important. And there are a handful of other projects like that where we can see the end in sight. We can see that gap closing. And we really have to place a sense of urgency on doing that because development is not going to stop. So it really is a race. But all those projects on the list have merit. That's why they're there.
Right. And that the Anatoliga Hammock project, that's another high priority project, cumulative just over 200,000 acres with only 8,000 acres left to be acquired. Right. So 96% complete. And I agree with you. That's a great one to finish the job and get it done. So the next program we're going to look at is the Rural and Family Lands Protection Program. This is a program hosted in the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services. Gene, do you want to tell us a little bit about the backstory behind this program?
Sure. Sure. And first, I'll put out there, I like this program. I think we need it. And it should be funded, but it is the second cousin to Florida Forever. So what Rural and Family Lands Program does, its entire goal is to protect agriculture. And I have resisted calling them, I'm going to do it this time and hopefully not again in this presentation, conservation easements. They are agricultural easements. And that distinction is really essential because first and foremost, this is about protecting lands that are in agricultural production and maintaining that agricultural production. And we know that over time, a farmer, a rancher, a forester, they may have to change how they use their land. Markets change, and so they're in the business. And so those easements allow a lot of flexibility in what the landowner can do. And in fact, protecting natural resources is secondary. It is actually stated as such in the statute. And so while those lands can have certain conservation values, maybe they can protect watersheds or floodplains, they might fill in a gap somewhere in the Florida wildlife corridor, but they can also just be highly altered. How much better is a peanut field as wildlife habitat than a shopping mall? It's better, but it's certainly not ideal. And so I think we make a mistake if we consider rural and family lands to really be a natural resource conservation program. And in contrast to Florida Forever, there is no fee simple purchase. These are all easements. And I've read a number of them. And some of the lands that have been protected through this program really have a lot of habitat value. But the natural areas within them can be converted to pine plantations or peanut fields or pretty much anything the landowner considers necessary in order for them to maintain an economically viable agricultural enterprise.
That is a best description I've heard maybe of the program, Gene. Can you talk for a moment about, you talked about the ARC process for Florida Forever and how rigorous and the various levels of public input, opportunities for that. Can you talk a little bit about the Rowan Family Lands process to get acquired? Is there anything similar to that ARC and Board of Trustees vote?
Not even close. There is a technical review team that is composed entirely of staff members from the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services. And they review the proposed properties and decide whether they merit being protected through the program. I'm not aware of any kind of public engagement in that. I don't think the public is invited to participate. Certainly, it's a willing landowner program. Again, there won't be any easement purchased if the landowner isn't ready to do that. But there is really no comparable kind of assessment process.
Very good. Ryan Worthington, would you talk a little bit about Rural Family Lands Appropriations funding first, which, as you can see, is quite different than what we saw for Florida Forever?
Yeah, it's as you can see by the graph, it's a little bit of a seesaw here, but in the 22-23, and then just recently with the this last legislative session period where they had almost I can't remember, it was like 240 250 260 million dollars to secure these agricultural easements, compared to what we were getting with the Florida Forever program of 18 million, which was originally funded at just 3. That contrasts the disparity. And one thing I'd like to add is I noticed in I think it was the 2024 legislative session, there was some open hostility in the legislature to purchasing conservation lands. And the answer they had was the rural and family land protections and, appropriations to, get the agricultural easements. And while that, I think a bill was filed, but it failed. In this last legislative session, I did not hear much. I was expecting to hear more hostility for conservation lands, but sure enough, when the budget was passed, as you can see, this last time they've got a ton of money compared to the Florida Forever program.
Right. And I would point out that 2023-24 appropriation, the legislature actually appropriated $100 million. But it was vetoed by Governor DeSantis. I believe him and Commissioner Simpson were in a bit of a tiff, and that funding ended up getting vetoed, but they have made up for it. So now, Ryan, could you? These are kind of the same numbers we saw for Florida Forever, but very different in scale. This is the Rural and Family Lands Needs Assessment published every year.
Yeah. And as you can see right here, it's a much smaller amount of money to secure. And also when you have, so it's 1.75 billion to secure the entire list there. And you have the increased funding. So yeah, it's about 13 years versus hundreds that you'd see with the rural and family lands to secure those agricultural easements. And one thing I'd also point out that Gene mentioned something really, it's a great point. This isn't for like habitat, or it doesn't have ecological value. So, agriculture, unfortunately, much of it causes, with the fertilizer going through our very porous soil and everything else, it causes damage to our springs, to the Lake Okeechobee, to the Everglades. It's there is some damage in those, and it's not all bad, but I think that's important to keep in mind. Like, yeah, it's much better than, say, development, but also there are some concerns when we secure these lands. I know in my neck of the woods, we have much smaller, farming operations. So I think it makes sense in my county. But if you have just hundreds of acres of sod farms or something like that, maybe not, where it's causing harm to the surrounding watershed.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, just to give an example, so this photo you're seeing here on the screen, this is from one of the state agencies' rural and family lands conservation easement. So I mean, this is, which it's a pretty photo, but I think that's terrible habitat. And when we think about development versus agriculture, and I think I'm in the minority in saying this, but if we're looking at it from a water perspective, a well-planned development does less harm than an intensive agricultural row crop operation or a dairy. Even on a septic tank, you would expect less than maybe a third of the nitrogen to reach the aquifer from a septic tank on a 1 acre property than if that 1 acre was in silage corn or some other intensive agricultural commodity. And I think the same is true of water use. And I know from a Springs perspective, that's one of our big concerns with, we, like Gene, I think rural and family lands has a place, but I think its place is well subordinate to programs like Florida Forever that are, really protecting and conserving land, and of course the public access. But if we're spending, 90% of our quote unquote land conservation funds, and I think you're 100% right, Gene, this isn't really a conservation easement program, it's an agricultural easement program. If we're spending 90% of those funds and locking in agriculture, which is the largest source of pollution to Florida Springs and many of the waters in South Florida, as well as the second largest water user, it's great that land won't be developed, but we're locking in a lot of the problems that are affecting our water resources. And we really need that fee simple acquisition of state forests and state parks and water management district lands to at least balance that out. Gene, you've put together some great maps that kind of highlight the differences between what kind of properties are being acquired through rural and family lands versus other programs. Would you walk us through those, please?
Sure. And quickly, this map, I just took it from the Florida Conservation Group's website, and they are an affiliation of ranchers and I believe forestry land owners. They support land conservation through both Florida Forever and rural and family lands. And in this map, at this scale, it may be difficult for you to see, but all that light green stuff, that's existing conservation. You see the Everglades National Park down there at the southern end of the state. And the dark green areas are approved Florida Forever project areas. And you can kind of see that more often than not, they are next to or maybe between some of those large tracts of existing conservation land. The lands in red are the purchased and approved rural and family land project areas. So they may be really hard to see, and in large part, that's because generally speaking, they are much smaller than Florida Forever projects. And you can't really tell in this view, but they're not often really associated with existing conservation lands. So if we go to the next slide, I wanted to give you that statewide perspective, but I also wanted to zoom in on a more discrete area to make that point. So here, again, those greens, existing conservation land. What you have in the middle on the top, that's Osceola National Forest. The big area in green on the bottom right there, that's Ocala National Forest. Just to provide you some geographic context, all those areas in blue, that's Florida Forever Project area. So you can see they're big, and more often than not, they're next to or providing linkages between the existing conservation lands. Again, in red, those are the rural and family land projects. And you see they're smaller, they're scattered all over. More often than not, they have no association at all with existing conservation lands. So they're not complementing the protection they provide. They're not helping to fill in any gaps. Now, any of you that really wants to delve into land conservation in Florida yourself a little more deeply, this is a screenshot from a web map that you can access on the Florida Natural Areas Inventory website. It's a fantastic tool. And that bullet list that you saw earlier with all those different data sets, geographic data sets that Division of State Lands uses to vet, to measure the conservation value of lands, that's all on this. So that thing you see on the right, that legend, you can actually scroll down and you could turn all those on. I think you might be able to just make out the Florida Wildlife Corridor. I didn't turn that on because it would get kind of loud. It would be much harder to interpret this map, but I did it myself. And if you go in and do that, you'll see that in almost every case, those Florida Forever Project areas, they are within the Florida Wildlife Corridor. In contrast, 3/4 of more of those little red rural and family land project areas are not even within the Florida Wildlife Corridor. So again, just contrasting the goals of the programs are different, and the kinds of lands they purchase very different. And if we really want to advance conservation, water resources, wildlife, plant life, we really need to put the stronger focus on Florida Forever.
Well said, Gene. All right, and now we're going to move on to our third and final major program. And this is Florida Communities Trust, which was mentioned a little bit earlier. But Gene, would you kind of give us a walkthrough of what FCT is and what kind of lands those are acquired? I think almost all of us have probably been to an FCT land, but we might not know it.
Right. And the whole goal of Florida Communities Trust was to give local governments an opportunity to achieve some land protection through the Florida Forever program. Like I said, Florida Community Trust, they had, I think it was 15% of the Florida Forever allocation. That was the formula back when it was used. And in many cases, the local government had to provide a match. Some of the smaller counties did not have to provide a 50% match. The state covered the whole purchase, but a local government would apply to have lands within their jurisdiction protected, typically for some kind of a park. And then they would again be vetted and ranked, and the ones that came out on top would get some of that funding. The kinds of lands that are protected, I live in Brooksville, and we have the Good Neighbor Trail here, connects with the Withlacoochee State Trail and Withlacoochee State Forest. The trailhead for that Good Neighbor Trail was purchased with an FCT grant. So I appreciate it every day, that program. It's done a lot of good things and really brought outdoor recreation closer to home for a lot of people.
Absolutely, good description. And Ryan Worthington, you want to take a look at what the disappointing funding I know for FCT advocates over the last 5 years.
Yeah, as you can see, it is fairly disappointing, um, and it's we're looking at what 15 million and over the course of the last two legislative sessions. And I'll say this: it's there's often a partnership with local governments where there is that match, or it's not just they're buying this property; they're partnering with local governments. So it's really important to fund this because I think as far as the state taxpayer goes, you get a bigger bang for your buck. And so seeing that the funding this sporadic and just in this low is pretty is saddening to me, especially in some metropolitan areas that really need this funding to secure some parks and recreation lands. This is where they go to. So that's why this is pretty sad to me.
Yeah, this program really does a lot to leverage the state's investment by inducing the local governments to partner.
I used to live next to Fred George Greenway, which is a really cool FCT project in Northwest Gainesville, and go run there. And I think it's kind of the best of what FCT is because it was 175 acres, and maybe 50 acres were ball fields and playgrounds and a running track. And then there was about 125 acres that was just left aside in nature. And I would get up early in the morning, go running, and foxes, coyote, deer, every kind of critter we had in Tallahassee was out there in the mornings. So a great program, one that well deserves more funding, and really connecting people with nature in those special places. And they do not have the same kind of list where we can look at how many projects they have on the list to be funded and those kind of things. But clearly they do need a lot more funding to be able to purchase those properties. So we've touched on this a little bit as we've gone, but I wanted to talk a little bit about the current political climate in the legislature. One of the things we're seeing a lot of questions on is what can we do to get more funding for land conservation programs. I know that is a major aim for Florida Springs Council, the entire environmental community, Florida Plant Society, a lot of these folks. However, the fact is that right now, last year and this year, while we have these particular leaders, especially in the Florida House of Representatives, I think it's going to be very difficult, and the Florida Senate really, because we have Senator President Albritton is a agricultural producer himself and a big champion of rural and family lands, and the House would rather just not spend money on any of it, I think, if they had their way. But this is a quote from the House Appropriations Chair Lawrence McClure, that he said during budget debates when a fellow member asked him about, why are we only funding rural and family lands and not providing funding for Florida Forever? And he said, I fundamentally and firmly believe that the private sector is a greater steward of the environment than government has ever dreamt of being. Ryan, Gene, do either one of you have any thoughts that brings to mind?
Well, first of all, I don't know how much clearer we can make it. Rural and family lands is not about protecting the environment. And so a rural and family land agricultural easement landowner can be doing all kinds of things, managing their property well for making money from the agricultural enterprise, but doing nothing to protect the environment. So this just conveys a complete lack of understanding for the goals of these programs and what they do. And it's been a hill we've been climbing, it seems like forever, to make the case that the state does manage its conservation lands well, some of them extremely well. I mean, from the water management districts to DEP, the state parks, we've won the national award, 4 times now? I mean, that is all a reflection that we have great people in those agencies that take a lot of pride in managing those lands. And I don't think anyone does it better. Our prescribed fire program I don't think there's anybody else in the country that can match it. So this is just completely either Mr. McClure doesn't understand, or he just is fundamentally opposed to real conservation.
Yeah.
Well said, Gene. Ryan, go ahead.
Yeah, now I want to echo what Gene said. I think it shows a very under appreciation for the folks that he represents, and the state workers that work really hard at maintaining these public lands. I mean, so you have prescribed fire. I think Florida's prescribed fire program is second to none. For example, we were advising California, as they've been struggling with wildfires, on how we do things here.
Yeah.
And also it's not just they go out and burn. You have biologists that go in and advise, okay, this is the proper time to burn so you don't harm this wildlife or these plants. There's so much that goes into maintaining our conservation areas by the state agencies and the hardworking state park employees and the Florida Forest Service. That I find this shocking. Now I understand where their argument, and I've heard it many times, that with when they have the private sector, the property's still on the tax rolls and they can get taxes for it. But agricultural land isn't taxed that much, and also the agricultural lobby is very strong, and they much more so than the conservation lobby, I would argue. That's me. So you put all that together, and then you get statements like this from our elected officials.
Right. And public lands, not only are the resources managed, they're made available for us to enjoy. Public access, all the recreational values, the hiking, the bicycling, the horseback riding, the hunting, those privately owned agricultural lands, they don't do any of that for us.
No.
Right. And I know, for years, one of the talking points in the legislature has been, we do this, the state does this terrible job managing lands. Yet, when I talk to people who actually get out on the lands, there's definitely invasive species problems in South Florida, but those are not land management problems. Those are different problems.
Yes.
But in general, I think Tall Timbers is largely thought of as kind of the national experts in north of Tallahassee on prescribed burning. They developed a lot of the science behind it. And I just think our state forests and state parks are among the most wonderfully managed lands anywhere as I go, hike across the country. And to where there are needs, the state, again, has plenty of money, right? So if our lands aren't being managed as we think they should, that is just a policy decision. The money is there. And it's starving a baby and then saying, well, the baby's sick, right? Well, maybe you should feed it. So, our lands are well managed. To the extent they can't, it's something we can solve. But I think we can't fall into this, trap of thinking, well, they're underfunding land management, therefore we should not be acquiring more lands. The truth is we should be acquiring lots of lands, and we should be funding land management to make sure that they are and continue to be well managed. I think it's a false dichotomy when people pit those things against each other.
Yeah, at the very beginning, you mentioned Amendment 1 that was passed a few years after the big recession, and it directs a third of the documentary stamp taxes to the Land Acquisition Trust Fund. Let's put that into perspective. Last year, that one third was about $1.3 billion.
Mm-hmm.
The Land Acquisition Trust Fund. And to say that we don't have money enough to spend more than $18 million on Florida Forever and to satisfy all the land management needs is just not true. It's
right. It's a policy choice. It's not a lack of the availability of funding. I think we did a really good job covering Florida Forever versus Rolling Family Lands. Thanks, Gene. So we'll skip over that one. I did want to raise Senate Bill 290. This was a bill that was just filed. It is the Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services bill for this year. Every year, more or less, every state agency will run a bill with their priorities. Some version of those bills is darn well guaranteed to pass. So this year we just saw the FDAX bill. It's got some good stuff in it, but one of the things that I know is very concerning, and Gene and I were on a call earlier today about it, is a provision that would allow the Department of Environmental Protection to surplus conservation lands and put them into agriculture with one of those rural and family lands conservation easements. Now, we saw a version of this pop up in 2024 that applied to every single parcel within the Florida Wildlife Corridor. Thanks to the good work of some of our lobbyists and friends in Tallahassee, we were able to beat that back. Surprised it did not come back last year, but here it is this year. Now, there are some conditions on it that it does not include state parks, state forests, or wildlife management areas. But, I think we're looking as we go through what the state owns, that there are, well over 100,000 acres of state-owned conservation land that does not fall into one of those categories. And I know this is something you've been thinking about, Gene, if you want to weigh in at all.
Yeah. I'm really hoping that we can figure out soon which lands are going to be put at risk by this. And I think it's also kind of perverse here to think about lands that the taxpayers paid for outright, fee title ownership, the idea that they could just be sold back into private ownership for agriculture, retain a rural and family land agricultural easement over it, and then the funds that are generated go to the Department of Agriculture to spend on more rural and family land agricultural easements. It's really just a diabolical way of taking lands out of conservation and putting them into agriculture.
Absolutely. And at the same time, losing public access to those lands.
Yeah.
Most likely. Anything you want to weigh in on that, Ryan?
No, it's, and I don't know, completely demonize maybe the rural and family lands. Like, I personally live around pine plantation, which is, pine trees that are grown for commercial use. And it's not ideal habitat as maybe as natural, but, if they were to conserve something like that, other than maybe row crops like, sod or corn being used not for human consumption, I would argue that would be good. But it's and I'm really hoping that the folks the conservation community has shown that they do have some muscle with things like guana and the Florida State Parks, development fiasco. And I hope we could mobilize for something like this to help protect our conservation lands against legislation like this, because that's terrible. And like you said, we've already paid for this land. We're enjoying this land also provides ecological services, meaning it's flood protection, right? So if you have floodplains, they help provide flood protection. It recharges the aquifer. There's so many things that they do just by existing, that if we turn it over to development or agriculture, intensive agriculture, then we're looking at problems. And I think that's a bad idea all the way around.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And speaking of that, I thought we'd close for questions going over some of the recent controversies. And, I've only been in this field about 15 years, but I have never seen the amount of controversies dealing with land acquisition programs and land swaps and things like that in the entire 15 years, as we've seen in maybe the last, 12 months. So, Gene, I know the Withlacoochee land swap, that's down near you, and that's something that you were very concerned about, but we managed to successfully fend off.
Yes. And the Withlacoochee land swap, the guana land swap, one of the things that really galls me is the statutes say that they open the door to these kinds of swaps, and they can be allowed on the condition that they result in a net conservation benefit. And, depending on who defines that, but the benefit is supposed to be to the land that is giving up the property. So land is being taken away, land is being added. the land that's added is supposed to add conservation value to the property that gave up the swap parcel. And in both of those cases, the lands that were proposed to be swapped in exchange for the public lands were nowhere near the property that was giving up land. So, I mean, there was one that was just approved by the Acquisition and Restoration Council at their last meeting with Withlacoochee State Forest. The forest would give up 60 acres that had been used by Citrus County as a landfill for decades. It's all old landfill. And so the county is proposing to buy that from the state, and in exchange give them about 150 acres just north that's contiguous with the state forest. And I look at that and say, now I can see a conservation benefit there. So I'm open to considering surplus sales and swaps, but they have to provide the benefit. And the problem is that the ones that are being proposed do no such thing.
Absolutely. And I would note that at 3:30 on Tuesday, I believe the 4th of November, the Senate Environment and Natural Resources Committee will actually have a presentation by DEP on conservation land swaps. And I'm very interested to see what DEP is saying to either justify or defend or admit that these are often not good ideas. One of the big recent controversies was the acquisition of 4 acres of sand. Well, I don't know how many acres there today. There were 4 acres at one point. Depending on the tide, there might be 2.5 acres. For over $80 million at the last Board of Trustees meeting, which is the governor and cabinet. And I wanted to highlight that because I think it really speaks to why programs like Florida Forever are so important. Because that program, that project was not part of Florida Forever. It wasn't part of any of these programs that we're discussing today, right? And I think that without, when we don't fund the programs, we really run the risk of our land conservation really becoming, a corporate socialism. Where basically the donors to big politicians are going to be able to get paid out of their bad investments, at 800% profit or whatever it is, because they were able to manipulate the system. And in all of the years of Preservation 2000, of Florida Forever, of all of these programs, we've never had an acquisition like that go through the program. And I think that's why it's so important. So we're going to get to our questions now, and then we will have last comments. So Chloe, if you want to throw up the questions, we'll get with them. Okay, Marty Proctor. Hey, Marty. Besides the state agencies, what are the best local channels to lobby with knowledge or to impact change? And I'm going to assume that this question is kind of geared towards land conservation. Either one of you have a thought there?
Well, it's often said the legislature controls the purse strings. And so right now, I would say, tell your representative and senator that you support land conservation and you want them to represent your interest in Tallahassee and support funding for Florida Forever.
Absolutely. And Ryan, people can do that at their delegation meetings if it hasn't happened, right?
Yes. Yeah, they still have a handful left, and that is, you get a few moments to speak directly to your state senator and rep, and just air out your concerns. So it's a. I know a lot of times I'm like, man, I'd love to have just a few minutes to talk to my elected officials, and the delegation meetings is your opportunity to do so. And as far as local channels, I would look at what is available. Obviously, I think the county is probably the best way to start. I know I'm lucky in Clay County. We approved to fund bonds to buy conservation lands, and they have a council of residents that are helping making those decisions. So I know there's a handful of counties that have those. What I would do is I would start talking to your local elected officials about getting something set up if you already don't have it. It can be put on the ballot as a referendum. People in the county can vote and choose to fund conservation land purchases locally, and you have a much better opportunity to have influence over that if you're involved in the local process. So that's something that I would definitely recommend if you're in a county that doesn't have a conservation land buying program.
Absolutely. And I think we had 4 or 5 of those on the ballot last election cycle, all in very conservative counties and all passed overwhelmingly. So true bipartisan issue. And yes, I think every local, every county would be well served to have one of these programs. Next question, Clay. As citizens and as volunteers, what is the single most effective thing we can do to promote land conservation, to protect Florida's water? Should we focus at the local or state level? Joe, thanks so much for being here, man. Miss having you on the lobby calls. I think that while local is important, I mean, the scope and the cost of this, I think it really has to be done at the state level through programs like Florida Forever. To me, like I said earlier, I think unfortunately this is going to be a very hard year to get that funding. One of the things that we've been discussing within the community is working with local folks and local groups to really highlight the individual projects. The program's great. Florida Forever is great, but it's kind of ephemeral as to what that means. But if we can really tie that funding back to protecting first magnitude springs, protecting the Lake Wales Ridge, protecting valuable ecosystems that people care about, right? We know that when a developer comes for one of those ecosystems, Floridians lose their minds and stand up to stop it. I think we need to be able to channel that kind of place-based love by also really championing specific projects on the Florida Forever list that could be acquired, especially those top ranked projects that really are the ones that should be funded. Gene, Ryan, anything you want to add?
Well, the highly ranked projects, yes. And maybe if it's about the love of the area, maybe look closer to home. Go to the Florida Natural Areas Inventory website. Look at that map. If you're not already aware of any Florida Forever projects near home, close to home for you. And I suggested contacting your representative and senator, your own legislators. Well, you can even get more specific and name the project area that's right there by you and tell them how important it is to you that area be protected and the benefits that would provide to their constituents. Tell them to be champions for that project. And if we have legislators all over the state that are going to be champions for the project that's in their backyard, I think we're going to have a whole bunch of champions for Florida Forever in Tallahassee.
Absolutely. Ryan?
Yeah, it's very similar. Contact elected officials. And if you don't have something that you're passionate about locally, you can just talk about, hey, increase conservation funding, fund Florida Forever. And I tell you what, it's important to do that because some of our state reps and senators is kind of the Maytag repairman kind of thing where they don't hear a lot. And if you just speak up yourself, that can make a huge difference. And of course, tell your friends. But I want to echo what Gene said, the Florida Natural Areas Inventory. If you want to learn, probably the single greatest resource out there to look at conservation lands around the state, that is the Florida Natural Areas Inventory. Now, you got to stick with it a little bit. It's the maps aren't easy to use as, say, like Google Earth, but they do have a lot of information that's available out there that I rely on myself.
Yeah. It takes a little time to learn how to navigate them, but they're extremely useful. I was just going to say, so we're going through a period now where the legislative delegations are setting up meetings across the state. So wherever you live, your county, all the representatives and senators for that county will schedule a delegation meeting. If you sign up to speak there, you'll probably be given 3 minutes. You can say a lot in 3 minutes. I don't want to dissuade anybody from going there. It's a good opportunity to speak to your legislators, but they're also home in their district for this part of the year. Mm-hmm. And so, I encourage, if there are any Florida Native Plant Society members out there, well, any of you really, go try to set up a meeting in person with your legislator in their district office. Maybe you'll only get 15 minutes, but that's 5 times 3 minutes. And maybe get together with some other like-minded people and form your own little delegation. And all of you go and share your concerns and what your priorities are. The reason I mentioned Native Plant Society, we are prepared to help our members set up meetings with their legislators if they contact us and help us to do that. We might have some inroads, some connections to help them set up those kinds of meetings.
Yeah, I hear you have an excellent lobbyist, Gene.
Yes.
All right, next question, Chloe. Also, Joe, if we committed to send some type of communication out once a day on land, water, in Florida, what would be the most effective? Who should we focus on? Ryan Worthington, I can't think of anyone better to answer this question.
To me, that's always changed. It is a moving target. Sometimes we have some extremely urgent issues, the land swaps, that horrible Destin Sandlot purchase. There's all kinds of things that I think joining a community, say like Florida Native Plant Society, Floridians Advancing Florida's Outdoors, Florida Springs Council, you name it, that will help put some of those priorities in front where you can respond. But yeah, it would. I'm looking at stay abreast of what issues are out there this time of year. It's like Gene and Ryan said. Meeting with elected officials before they get tied up in Tallahassee. But I like phone calls. I mean, I think if you're looking at effectiveness, I think meeting in person is probably the most effective. Phone calls, emails after that, depending on the issue, and then social media posts. But the good thing about social media posts, emails, and phone calls is we can spread the word. So I think not only acting, but also spreading the word is also important. And I hope that kind of answers the question.
Yeah.
Yep. And, I would say, whether depending on kind of what your focus is, whether it's Floridians Advancing Florida's Outdoors or Florida Native Plant Society or the Florida Springs Council, whenever you get with one of those groups, one, you're going to make your life a lot easier because we're going to help you figure out, things like the bills that were just filed, like 290, and kind of help you direct that. But also because we're pulling our resources and getting thousands of people to all contact legislators on the same issue, I think that's a great way to amplify your effectiveness, especially if you're not a Ryan Worthington with a giant social media following and you're just a Ryan Smart with an email address. It really helps to be, one of thousands to help spread the word. Next one, Clay. Hey, Rick, conserving land appears to be very popular with Florida citizens and voters. What is the most effective action citizens can do to get the legislature and governor to increase funding for conservation this fiscal year? Very similar question. Same answer. We need to be contacting our legislators. We need to be talking about individual projects. We're going to be pushing hard for more appropriations this year, but I also think, this is going to be an important year for laying the groundwork with our next generation of legislative leaders. In other words, the folks are going to be taking over in 2027 for the 27 and 28. I think we need to really get some champions in leadership, which I think we could have in the future, that can bump those appropriations back up to where they should be, set that mark, and then we can have something to keep fighting for going forward.
Yes, and you mentioned incoming leadership. I I think that'll be Senator Boyd would be the starting, not in 2026, but in 2027. If Senator Boyd happens to be your senator and you're out there, start cultivating him now. Let him know that you support land conservation, because he will have a lot of clout for those 2 years when he'll be presiding over the Senate. The same would go for the incoming, the next Speaker of the Florida House. I'm not sure who that is. Ryan, you may know.
Yeah, that's going to be Representative Sam Garrison, who is from Northeast Florida. He is very close with the Bradleys, and I think will hopefully be a champion for our issues. Still to be seen, but that is definitely our hope. Next question, Chloe. How can I protect green spaces in my area? The spaces serve my community to help with floods in the area. I'm scared it can be developed since I'm not officially protected. What do you think, Gene? Lee's got some property near her that needs to be protected, green space. How would you suggest she go about that?
Well, it's very similar to the questions we've already answered, but smaller areas like that that might be threatened by development. I mean, if it's in a floodplain, press your local government, your county commission, or your city council to protect those areas. Follow what the water management district is doing. There are ways those lands can be maintained as green space without actually buying them, without putting them in public ownership. That is one other avenue, kind of regulatory protection.
Absolutely. All right, Chloe, any questions left? All right, last question. Do recreational parks help with conservation? Absolutely. Anything that does not have development or agriculture on it is doing the Lord's work with ecosystem services and providing recharge and filtering out pollutants. And, we love to see as many natural lands as possible left, to be in one of these regulatory programs where they're conserved forever. But, any stretch of forest that you drive by that doesn't have ag or a house on it is really important. And, that's the goal here, is to protect as many of those parcels as possible. And those green spaces, those were really what FCT, Florida Communities Trust, will be protecting if it can get the funding that it needs.
Yeah. And, more and more we find that it's important for our health, not just our physical health, to get outside and recreate and be in nature. It's important for our emotional and mental health. I mean, it's really good for us in so many ways. So those parks, they provide that avenue to get out there and enjoy some sun and fresh air and hear the birds. And
absolutely.
Part of the circle of life.
Really appreciate everyone for hanging in with us. Ryan Worthington, any closing thoughts?
Yeah. Kind of echoing what Gene said, as I explore conservation areas around Florida, I know a big draw for, people around the world is coming to Orlando and seeing the theme parks. But man, if you're paddleboarding and see a curious manatee or snorkeling in the Springs, or just, doing a wet walk through the Everglades, our conservation areas are just unmatched here in Florida. And another thing, I know I represent Floridians Advancing Florida's Outdoors. We do advocacy. But let me tell you something, Florida Native Plant Society and Florida Springs Council, if you are not already plugged in, please check them out. I used to think Florida Native Plant Society was, just about native plants. They are an advocacy. They're an advocacy powerhouse. and I got my start working with the Florida Springs Council. They're a huge reason why I have the knowledge that I have and able to mobilize other folks to be effective advocates for our conservation areas.
Thanks, Ryan. Gene, any closing thoughts?
No, I appreciate you bringing us all together, Ryan. I love what the Springs Council does. I'm a sustaining member, I think, and keep up the good work.
Thanks. And we appreciate both of you coming on so much. Genuinely two of my favorite people in the conservation community. We're going to be back next month with a legislative preview and a look at how to be effective citizen advocates. Very excited that Travis Moore, who is both Florida Plant Society and Florida Springs Council's lobbyist, is going to be joining us for that. If anybody happened to be lucky enough to be at the Springs Summit this year and see Travis's presentation, he is really one of the most knowledgeable and just one of my favorite people, one of the best lobbyists in town. So thank you all for being here. If you enjoyed this webinar, it'll be up on YouTube probably in the morning or something. So we really encourage you to, help us out, share this with anyone else you think might enjoy it. And we'll see you all again soon. Have a great evening.
Good night, everybody.